The lone sheriff arrested the girl everyone feared, but Blue, when she said, "You look like me." On a freezing October morning in 1884, in the small town of Dry Creek, Texas, Sheriff Samuel Hayes received the call that would change his life forever. A young woman, just 17 years old, had been captured after weeks of terrorizing traders and travelers on the dusty roads that crisscrossed the territory. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and everyone knew her as the Desert Serpent, a nickname that chilled the blood of the bravest men in the land. Samuel walked the dirt streets, his heavy boots echoing against the dry ground, while the hot wind carried the smell of dust and sweat. At 42, he was a man marked by loneliness and the weight of a lifetime dedicated to the law in a place where justice often arrived too late. His calloused hands held the prison keys with a firmness that hid the uncertainty growing in his chest. No one expected such a young girl to be capable of such violence, but the reports were consistent. She showed no mercy, did not ask for forgiveness, and her eyes were described as empty, soulless. Share this story to reach further, subscribe to the channel, share this video on WhatsApp, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'll be very happy to read each comment. Samuel pushed open the heavy jail door, and the creak of its hinges cut through the silence like a sharp blade. There she was, sitting in the corner of the cell, her hands dirty with dirt and her disheveled hair covering part of her face. Clara Whitmore wasn't what he expected to see. Not the wild creature the stories depicted, but a frail young woman with torn clothes and bare feet. Her eyes, when they finally lifted to meet his, weren't empty, as everyone had said. They were deep, filled with a pain Samuel recognized immediately, as if he were looking into a clouded mirror of his own past. "So you're the famous Sheriff Hayes," she said, her husky voice breaking the heavy silence of the prison. There was something in the way she said his name that made Samuel hesitate, as if she knew parts of him that even he himself dared not revisit. The air between them seemed charged with a strange tension, not of fear or hostility, but of a mutual recognition neither of them could explain. Samuel felt his hands tremble slightly as he held the keys, and it took effort to keep his voice steady when he answered, "And you're Clara Whitmore, the girl who's been keeping half of Texas awake at night." Clara stood up slowly, like a wounded animal testing its ability to move. Her movements were cautious, but there was a strange dignity in her posture that contrasted with the dirt and wounds that marred her body. "They told you about me, didn't they?" she asked, taking a step toward the bars. "They told you I'm a monster, that I kill for pleasure, that I have no heart." Her words came slowly, each one heavy as stones dropped into a deep well, and Samuel felt something twist in his stomach. "They told me," Samuel admitted, but his voice lacked the steel it should have. There was something in Clara's expression that completely disarmed him, a vulnerability she tried to hide behind a mask of indifference. "But I've learned over the years that stories don't always tell the whole truth." He took a step closer to the bars, ignoring the voice in his head, warning him of the dangers of getting too close. "Why did you do it, Clara? Why did you choose this path?" The question seemed to pierce Clara's defenses like a well-aimed arrow. Her eyes filled with tears, she fought back, and her hands clenched into fists so tight her knuckles turned white. "Choice," she repeated, her voice shattering like glass. "You think I chose this? That I woke up one day and decided to become what everyone told me I was?" Samuel felt his chest tighten, recognizing that pain. It was the same one he'd carried for years, the same one that had made him the lonely man he was today. It was at that moment that Clara spoke the words that would change everything. "You look like me, Sheriff. Not in your face, but in here." She touched her chest with a trembling hand. "You too carry the weight of things you can't change, don't you? You too have been judged for crimes you didn't commit, for choices you never had the chance to make." Samuel felt as if he had been punched in the gut, for she had touched wounds he thought were well hidden. In that moment, he realized he was not dealing with a common criminal, but someone who, like him, had been shaped by the cruel circumstances of life in the Old West. Over the next few days, Samuel found himself returning to the jail more often than necessary. Officially, he needed to question Clara about her crimes, but the truth was that something about her fascinated and disturbed him at the same time. She wasn't like the other prisoners who had passed through her cells. She didn't beg for freedom, she didn't deny her actions, but she also showed no pride or satisfaction in what she had done. It was as if she had accepted her fate long ago, resigned to carrying a burden that seemed too great for her young shoulders. "Tell me about your family," Samuel asked on a particularly hot afternoon when the sun beat down mercilessly on the streets of Dry Creek. Clara sat in the same position as always, leaning against the cold stone wall of the cell. But this time her eyes never left his. "I don't have a family," she replied simply, but there was a bitterness in her voice that betrayed the simplicity of her answer. "I never did, actually. My parents abandoned me when I was 5, saying I was cursed, that I brought bad luck wherever I went." Samuel felt a tightness in his chest at the words, for they echoed memories he'd rather keep buried. "Cursed?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. Clara let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "I was born during a terrible storm that destroyed half my father's plantation. My mother died in childbirth, and ever since, every time something bad happened, they said it was my fault. When the drought came, when the cattle died, when the house burned down, it was always my fault." Her words came slowly, as if each one cost a piece of his soul, and Samuel felt his own breath grow heavy. "You can't be responsible for storms or droughts," Samuel said, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. Clara looked at him with an expression that mixed gratitude and disbelief. "Try telling that to a 5-year-old who hears it every day," she replied. "When you grow up hearing that you're a curse, that you bring misfortune to everyone around you, you start to believe it. And when you believe that—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "You stop fighting it and simply become what everyone expects you to be." Samuel knew this feeling well. He himself had grown up being called the devil's son because of the circumstances of his birth and his father's reputation. "I understand," he said, the words tumbling out before he could control them. "My father was an outlaw, a man who brought shame to our family. When he died, I swore I would be different, that I would prove I wasn't like him. But sometimes—" He stopped, realizing he was revealing more than he intended. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm just running from something I'll never escape." Clara stood and walked to the bars, her fingers curling around the cold metal bars. "You became sheriff to prove you weren't like your father," she said, and it wasn't a question, but a statement. "I became what everyone said I was to stop fighting the inevitable. See how similar we are?" Samuel felt as if she'd opened a book he'd thought was locked away. "Both prisoners of the past," he murmured, and Clara nodded slowly. "The difference is, you chose an honorable prison, and I chose an iron one." At that moment, Samuel realized that Clara wasn't just a criminal he needed to judge, but a lost soul who mirrored his own inner struggles. He began to question everything he thought he knew about justice, choices, and the weight of the past on a person's life. The afternoon was drawing to a close, and the long shadows casting across the jail bars seemed to symbolize the shadows they both carried in their hearts. The following week, Samuel found he couldn't leave the prison. Each conversation with Clara revealed deeper layers of a story that simultaneously disturbed and moved him. She had told him about years living alone in the desert, surviving on what she could find or steal, always fleeing towns that rejected her before they even knew her. "People are afraid of what they don't understand," she said one morning as she watched the sun rise through the small cell window. "And a girl alone, with no family, no name, that scares her more than any gun." Samuel brought her decent food and clean clothes, ignoring the curious stares and gossip that had begun to circulate around town. "Why are you being nice to me?" Clara asked, holding the bowl of hot soup in her hands as if it were a precious treasure. "All the other sheriffs treated me like a wild animal." Samuel stopped organizing the papers on his desk and looked her straight in the eye. "Because I see in you what no one else can," he replied honestly. "I see someone who has been hurt by the world, not someone who hurts the world for pleasure. It was then that Clara decided to tell him the truth about her crimes. "I never killed anyone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I robbed, yes, but I never hurt anyone. I just wanted food, a place to sleep, clothes to keep warm." Samuel felt his world tilt slightly. "But the witnesses said—" Clara shook her head. "The witnesses saw what they wanted to see. A young girl, alone, desperate. It's easier to believe I'm a monster than to admit that a child was abandoned to her fate." Her words fell like stones into a calm lake, creating ripples that spread through Samuel's heart. "Are you telling me you've never hurt anyone?" Samuel asked, needing to be sure. Clara nodded, tears finally streaming down her face. "I pointed an old rusty gun that didn't even work. I asked for just enough to survive another day. When people gave me food or money, I always said thank you." The irony of the situation struck Samuel like a lightning bolt. The entire town lived in fear of a girl who said thank you to her supposed victims. "So why didn't you defend yourself? Why didn't you tell the truth?" Clara wiped her tears with the torn sleeve of her shirt. "Who would believe me? A nameless orphan with no family, nothing. It would be easier for everyone if I were truly the monster they thought I was." She stood and walked to the window, watching the people pass by on the street. "Besides, I kind of believed they were right, that I really was cursed, that I deserved to be punished for all the evil I'd supposedly caused." Samuel felt anger rise in his chest, not at herself, but at a world that had so utterly failed a child. "You're not cursed," Samuel said with a firmness that surprised them both. "You're a survivor, a girl who did what she had to do to stay alive in a world that abandoned her." Clara turned to him, her eyes shining with an emotion Samuel couldn't identify. "Do you really believe that?" she asked, her voice filled with a fragile hope that seemed about to shatter. "I do," Samuel replied without hesitation, "and I'm going to prove it to you and everyone in this town." In that moment, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Samuel spent the next few nights reviewing all the accounts of the crimes attributed to Clara, searching for inconsistencies and details that might support his version of events. He rode for miles through the desert, visiting the robbery victims, asking questions no one had ever asked before. Gradually, a pattern began to emerge. All the victims confirmed that the girl had never been violent, that she always asked only for what was necessary, and that many of them had secretly felt sorry for her. "She seemed so lost," said Martha Henderson, a shopkeeper who had been robbed 3 months earlier. "I almost offered to have her come home for dinner, but my husband said it would be dangerous." Back in jail, Samuel shared his findings with Clara, who listened silently, as if unable to believe someone was finally hearing her side of the story. "Does this mean you're going to release me?" she asked, but there was more fear than hope in her voice. Samuel could tell she feared freedom as much as she had feared prison. "It means I'll fight for you," he replied. "But first I need to know, what do you want to do with your life if you get out of here?" Clara looked at him in surprise, as if no one had ever asked her that before. I never thought about it," she admitted, her voice small and vulnerable. "I've always lived one day at a time, just trying to survive. I never imagined I could have a real life, with plans and dreams." Samuel felt his heart sink as he realized how the world had robbed her of even the ability to dream. "Well, now you have time to think," he said gently, "because I won't let you go back to that life. You deserve better than this." Clara looked at him with tears in her eyes, and Samuel saw in her the child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. However, not everyone in town was willing to accept Samuel's version of Clara. A group of men, led by Jake Morrison, a wealthy merchant who had lost money in one of the robberies, began pushing for a swift execution. "She's dangerous," Morrison insisted during meetings at the tavern. "We can't let a sentimental sheriff put us at risk." Tensions in the town began to rise, and Samuel realized he would need more than evidence to save Clara. He would need the courage to face an entire community. One night, when Samuel was working late in his office, Clara called out to him from her cell. "Sheriff Hayes," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet of the jail. "I know you're trying to help me, but maybe it's best to leave things as they are. I don't want you to get hurt because of me." Samuel stopped what he was doing and walked to the cell. "Why would you say that?" he asked. Clara was sitting on the floor, hugging her knees. "Because you're a good person, and I've brought enough trouble to good people. Maybe it's just my destiny." "No," Samuel interrupted firmly. "It's not your destiny. Your destiny is what you make of it from now on." He knelt on the other side of the bars, bringing himself to eye level with her. "Clara, you've spent too long believing what others have said about you. It's time to discover who you really are when no one is telling you who you should be." His words touched something deep in Clara's heart, and she nodded slowly, as if waking from a long nightmare. The next morning, Samuel was confronted by the city's mayor, accompanied by Jake Morrison and other influential men. "Hayes, the city's patience is at its limit," the mayor said, his voice thick with authority. "The people want to see justice served, and justice in this case means a speedy trial and a final sentence." Samuel kept his expression calm, but inside he felt a storm brewing. "True justice demands that all the facts be presented," he replied, "and the facts show that Clara Whitmore is not the murderer you think she is." Jake Morrison stepped forward, his eyes flashing with anger. "She's a criminal, Hayes. She robbed honest people, spread terror on the streets. It doesn't matter if she killed anyone or not." Samuel felt anger rise in his chest, but he controlled himself. "It does matter, Morrison. It matters a lot. The difference between a desperate robbery and a cold-blooded murder is the difference between redemption and conviction." The mayor sighed heavily. "You have until tomorrow to decide, Hayes. Either you do your job, or we find someone who will." Samuel knew he was running out of time. He spent the rest of the day riding around the outskirts of town, searching for more evidence that might help Clara. That's when he encountered Tom Bradley, an old farmer who had been robbed by Clara months earlier. "That girl," Tom said, scratching his grey beard. "She looked more scared than I did when she stopped me on the road. She said she'd been hungry for days, that she didn't want to hurt me." Tom looked at Samuel with kind eyes. "I gave her more money than she asked for, and some food from the saddle. She cried and thanked me like an angel." Back in town, Samuel found Clara quieter than usual. "You heard what's happening outside," he said, and it wasn't a question. Clara nodded slowly. "I heard people talking in the street. They want to see me hanged." Her voice was calm, but Samuel could see the fear in her eyes. "I won't let that happen," he promised, but Clara shook her head. "You can't fight an entire town for me. It's not worth throwing your life away for someone like me." "Someone like you," Samuel repeated, feeling angry at the way she belittled herself. "Clara, you are one of the bravest people I've ever known. You survived alone for years, faced the entire world, and still kept enough kindness in your heart to thank the people who helped you." Clara looked at him in surprise, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Do you really see me that way?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do," Samuel replied without hesitation, "and I will make sure others see it too." Samuel stayed awake all night, devising a desperate plan. He knew he couldn't win by force. It was just one man against an entire town. But perhaps he could win by heart, touching the humanity of those who had been driven by fear and prejudice. He wrote letters to some influential people in the town, telling them Clara's true story, his discoveries about the crimes, and most importantly, about the lost girl who hid behind her reputation as a criminal. When the sun rose that morning, Samuel knew it would be one of the most important days of his life. He had made a decision that would change everything. He would not only fight for Clara, but he would adopt her as his own daughter, giving her the name and family she had always been denied. "Clara," he said when he arrived at the jail, "I have a proposal for you. But first, I need to know, do you trust me?" Clara looked him in the eyes for a long moment, and Samuel saw a determination in them that had not been there before. "I do," she replied, and Samuel knew they were both ready to face whatever came next. The day of the impromptu trial arrived like an inevitable storm. Dry Creek's central square was packed with people, all eager to see the outcome of the story that had dominated town conversation for weeks. Samuel walked through the crowd with Clara at his side, feeling the heavy stares and hostile murmurs that followed. Clara held her head high, but Samuel could feel her hand trembling slightly as she gripped his arm. "Remember what we talked about," he whispered to her. "You're not alone in this." Jake Morrison had appointed himself prosecutor, and his voice echoed across the square as he listed the crimes attributed to Clara. "This girl has brought terror to our streets," he shouted, pointing dramatically at Clara. "She has robbed honest people, spread fear among our families." The crowd murmured in approval, but Samuel noticed that some people seemed less convinced than others. This was his chance. He stood and asked permission to speak, his firm voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Samuel began, his voice carrying all the authority he had accumulated over years of serving as sheriff. "You came here today seeking justice, and I am here to tell you that justice demands you hear the full truth." He walked to the center of the square, where everyone could see him clearly. "Clara Whitmore is not the monster you think she is. She is an orphan abandoned at the age of 5, a child who had to learn to survive alone in a world that rejected her before it even knew her." Samuel told Clara's full story, from her abandonment to her years living alone in the desert. He presented the evidence he had collected, the testimonies he had gathered, and most importantly, the truth about the crimes she had committed. "She robbed, yes," he admitted, "but she never hurt anyone. She never killed anyone. She simply tried to survive the only way she knew how." The crowd began to murmur, some in anger, others in curiosity, and Samuel sensed that some people were beginning to question their own certainties. It was then that Tom Bradley stood up in the crowd. "The sheriff is telling the truth," he shouted, his harsh voice cutting through the noise. "That girl mugged me 3 months ago, and I've never seen anyone as scared as she was. She cried when I gave her food, said she hadn't eaten in days." Others began to speak up, people who had been mugged by Clara but had never spoken about the more human details of their encounters. "She thanked me," one woman said. "What kind of vicious criminal would thank you?" Clara, who had remained silent throughout the trial, finally stood up. "May I speak?" she asked, her voice trembling but determined. Samuel nodded, and she addressed the crowd. "I did wrong things," she began, tears streaming down her face. "I assaulted you because I was hungry, because I was cold, because I didn't know how else to survive. But I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted to exist." Her words were simple, but they carried an emotional weight that touched many hearts in the crowd. "I know I can't undo what I've done," Clara continued, her voice growing stronger. "But if you give me a chance, I swear I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the person you deserve to have in your community." Samuel felt pride swell in his chest at seeing Clara's courage. "And I will stand by her," he announced to the entire square. "I adopt Clara Whitmore as my daughter. She will be Clara Hayes from this day forward, and I will stand by her." The crowd fell silent, processing this unexpected declaration. Jake Morrison tried to protest, but his voice was drowned out by others rising in support of Clara. Martha Henderson, the shopkeeper who had been robbed, stood up. "If Sheriff Hayes is willing to take on this responsibility, then I support the girl," she said. "We've all been through hard times, and we've all needed a second chance." One by one, others began to speak out, and Samuel sensed that the community's heart was beginning to open to Clara. The mayor, seeing the change in the crowd's mood, made a decision. "Clara Whitmore, or rather Clara Hayes," he said, "you are free, but under the custody and responsibility of Sheriff Hayes. You will do community service to make up for your crimes and prove that you deserve to be a part of this community." Clara burst into tears, not of sadness, but of relief and gratitude. Samuel hugged her, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. 2 years had passed since that day in the Dry Creek Square, and Clara Hayes, now 19, had become one of the most respected people in town. She worked at the local school, helping younger children with their homework, and had become a kind of counselor for other young women struggling. Samuel watched with pride as his adopted daughter blossomed, discovering talents and dreams he had thought were lost forever. "Daddy!" she called him now, and every time he heard the word, Samuel felt his heart warm. Clara had married James Turner, a kindly young farmer who had seen beyond her past reputation and fallen in love with the courageous and compassionate woman she had become. Their wedding was celebrated by the entire town, a demonstration of how forgiveness and second chances can transform not just a life, but an entire community. Samuel walked her down the aisle, feeling prouder than he had ever imagined possible. The morning after the wedding, Clara visited Samuel at his home. "I wanted to thank you," she said, holding his calloused hands. "You saved me, Father, not just from prison, but from myself. You taught me that I wasn't what others said I was." Samuel smiled, his eyes filling with tears. "You saved yourself, Clara. I just showed you the right mirror to see yourself in." Clara laughed, that sweet laugh that had become Samuel's favorite song. "You know what's funny?" Clara said, looking out the window at the streets of Dry Creek. "I used to believe I was cursed, that I brought bad luck wherever I went. But now I realize that maybe I was a blessing in disguise. My story taught this town about forgiveness, about second chances, about looking beyond appearances." Samuel nodded, hearing the wisdom in her words. "And you taught me that it's never too late to have a family," he replied. Years later, as Samuel lay on his deathbed, Clara held his hand and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me when no one else could. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. Thank you for giving me a name, a family, a chance to be more than my past." Samuel smiled, his eyes shining with fatherly love. "Thank you for teaching me that sometimes we save others only to find ourselves saved," he whispered back. And so, in a town that had learned about forgiveness and redemption, two lost souls found each other and discovered that true family is not the one we are born into, but the one we choose to build. Thank you for following this moving story to the end. If this narrative touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this. Share this video with your friends and family on WhatsApp and help spread messages of hope and redemption. Leave a comment where you're watching from and tell us which part of the story resonated with you most. I love reading each comment and hearing how these stories impact you. Keep browsing the channel to discover more narratives that will move and inspire you. Until the next story.